I was talking with a client um, recently, and we were talking about individual growth versus growth in a relationship. And one of the things that I told him initially was, as it relates to individual growth, you want to be mindful of your weaknesses, but you really don't want your weaknesses on the forefront, because I don't think that working on weaknesses directly is effective. Rather, if you're going to do personal growth, I think it is so important for you to identify your strengths and build and keep that on the forefront of your consciousness as far as building on your strengths, so that you can further work on your weaknesses over time. And for that particular client, he was perplexed because um, on his end, he had experienced a series of grievances in his relationship. And he was like, Larry, if I only work on my strengths and keep my weakness on the back burner, it's not going to help my relationship. And we began to talk about individual growth objectives versus relationship growth objectives, and the mesh of the two in a relationship. So whereas in individual growth, you really do want to focus on your strengths and allow your strengths to help compensate for your weaknesses. I mean, that's a solid strategy there. But in a relationship, you have to do a combination of some things, which includes you individually working on your own independent growth. But growth in a relationship looks a little bit more diplomatic, especially as it relates to relationship grievances, right? And the reason why is because, as I stated in my previous post, we're all sort of in a relationship. You're one of the crutch points in a relationship is emotional and cognitive perspective. In other words, how we contend or deal with how other people frame who we are and what we've done and what we're doing in the relationship. And in under that context, your strategy for growth changes a little bit. Whereas I'm still working on my strengths and really having a forgiving attitude towards my weaknesses, identifying that inevitably my strengths, and asking myself, how do I compensate for my weaknesses, but making sure I'm being extremely mindful of my strengths and the role that it plays in helping me overcome my weaknesses. But at the same time, in a relationship, really trying to answer or meet the needs of the relationship, which means that perceptively, how do I best explain this? In a relationship, it means that you're going to target working on your weaknesses, but that's only to appease the perspective of the other individual. And this goes into a more lengthy and thicker discussion point with regards to, just because somebody says you're doing something does not mean that that's actually what you're doing or that's actually who you are. But we do, in a relationship, have the obligation to try to resolve that perspective in order to create empathy in the relationship, which then gives the buffer for our flaws and mistakes in a relationship, right? So somebody saying I'm doing something and I disagree on that narrative, I still, in theory, have an obligation to try to resolve that narrative as a helper to that individual. I don't have, it's not my obligation to force anybody to think a certain way, but it is my job to try to answer to what a person is saying is negatively impacting them that I'm contributing to, if that makes any sense, right? And this conversation that I had with my client, it completely broadened his perspective, because he was like, man, my wife was telling me about all these things I need to do, and I thought that that's who I was. I was like, no, she has her perception of who you are, but you should have your own independent perception of who you are with regards to your strengths and weaknesses. As I was telling a friend of mine, I was like, our partners and our kids are going to have their perception of ourselves, but it's so important to have our own perception of ourselves, to have our own sense of resolve between us and God. Whether you be man or woman, it's so important for you to have a sense of conclusive resolve about who you are between you and God, or who you are in the universe if you don't believe in God, so that it does not get poisoned with other people's perspective. Again, it doesn't mean that we should not answer to other people's perspective, but sometimes in a relationship in particular, we hold too much weight to what a person is saying is wrong with us, not realizing that that person's own perception is clouded with misguidance, with false conclusions, with skewed perspective, and even with their own biological wiring that might skew how they view things. Whether let's say a person struggles with depression or they struggle with anxiety. Well, you don't think that's going to skew their perspective on their environment, let alone their partner. So the approach that I recommend in general is understanding the difference between working on yourself individually and understanding versus working on yourself in a relationship. And the two are not the same in my opinion. I think that what I do individually between me and God is ultimately the foundational piece that has to be resolved. But it is important to resolve the needs of my partner if she's identifying that there are areas where that person is not getting filled, or there are areas that are causing barriers in the relationship. It's just as important to meet those needs, even if I disagree. And moreover, as far as the overarching commentary to this is never take somebody's perception of you for face value. Make sure that you are filtering out yourself with proper wisdom and counsel that is beyond just one person's perspective. Moreover than that, we live in such a unforgiving, unredemptive world. Everybody has a hard time forgiving. Everybody wants you to pay the ultimate consequence to your decision making. Everybody wants you to feel a level of shame and guilt when you make mistakes in this world across the board. And for the believers, it is so important that we continue to walk in the forgiveness, redemption, and reconciliation of God within ourselves, and even how we project ourselves to others. Be first willing to forgive. Be mindful of forgiving yourself as far as being present forward. That if I did something, I'll own it. If I did something I don't even agree with it, I'll own it. I'll still own it as far as present forward. In other words, if it affected you, again, then let's do something about it. Even if I don't think that I'm the ultimate, contributor to whatever your perspective is. But I forgive me, and I forgive you, and I forgive the circumstance. And I'm willing to not get caught up in letting a circumstance or a person prevent me from resolving peace in my life moving forward. I think that's so important. Again, my overarching commentary, even as it relates to the conversation, is be mindful that when people have their perception about you, that you forgive yourself first, and secondarily forgive the environment. Because, the function of forgiveness is really just letting go of the bondage as it relates to our past errors or the errors of other people, if that makes any sense. Like, remove that bondage from yourself. Let us forgive one another. Let us forgive ourselves so that we can walk in peace and walk in the freedom of change moving forward, rather than being bound by the characterizations of who we were in the past. I hope this was helpful. If you like this, please like, share, tell other people if you thought this was profound insight or you got a nugget from it. And if you feel real froggy, reach out and contact me. Always looking to network. You guys have a great day. God bless.